Righto, game makers. Today I wanted to talk about anger and fear, and kind of the way they interact in game design. So, I forget how I even got this idea. I was talking to somebody in a call. But anyway, the idea is, quite often in video games you want to evoke a specific mood, or you want to evoke a certain feeling in the player. And you want to do that almost more than you want to have a certain gameplay experience. It really is about triggering emotions in some ways. And so because of that, it's useful to know how emotions work, and it's also good to remember that the emotions your players experience playing your game has an awful lot to do with the rules and the way you've set things up. So if you're trying to create a certain experience, there really is a kind of mechanical, rule-based way of triggering emotions in your players, pretty much. And something I've been interested in is games that feel fast and aggressive. And what's a bit counterintuitive about this is if you're playing a game like Doom Eternal or something where it's just constantly attacking demons, you might think this is kind of a power fantasy. Everyone loves to talk about Doom Guy being this power fantasy where he's killing demons all the time. But the necessary other side to this is that to have your player incentivized to constantly attack demons all the time, there has to be this underside of fear to it, basically. So what I think no one wants to talk about is that Doom Guy is afraid, and that's why he's angry. Because that's how anger and fear work.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate.
I mean, I'm not massively up on the science on this, but basically it's to do with the fight or flight response, and anger and fear are kind of two... I hate to use the cliche of they're two sides of the same coin, but it may actually be very appropriate here. So if you think you can't handle the enemy, you run away, and if you think you can handle them, then it becomes anger and aggression. So they're very much about the same thing. And this is why in games, quite often, particularly fighting games, or any game where you're forced to fight, they force you into an aggressive stance by closing the door behind you. And I remember this happening constantly in Zelda. You enter a dungeon, you go into a room, the door closes behind you, and I think in Ocarina of Time there was this whole animation of the door was behind you, and Link has this kind of look behind him, the door is closed animation, because closing the door behind you is so important to making it aggressive. And now, that just without even really thinking about it explicitly, that communicates that you have to fight. And this happens constantly in stuff like Devil May Cry. You'll see the doors close themselves with some magic so that you have to fight, and it just closes off that option. So, and you have to wonder what Devil May Cry would be like if you could just run away, you know? That would be a very different game. So, that's a good tip as well. If you want your players to feel aggressive, just close the door behind them and make sure they can't get too far and they've got no choice but to fight. I think there's all sorts of quotes. I'm not even going to bother to get a quote this time, just screw it. But there's all sorts of quotes about, you know, cornered animals and everything. Everyone knows that when your back is up against the wall, that's when you see new aggression. I'll probably make a separate video about health systems later, but one thing to keep in mind is, to make your player feel vulnerable, it doesn't just have to be about dying quickly necessarily. It can just be about long-term consequences for getting hit as well. So you could have a bunch of health, but it's hard to regain it. That would also be a trigger for aggression. So it doesn't just have to be like you die in a few seconds, it could be you have this health but it doesn't regenerate. So Doom might be an example of that. You're very much encouraged to shoot the demons fast because although there's kind of medipacks around and everything, it's a bit survival horror-ish in that there's just supplies of everything. Everything's finite, so you've kind of got to make do with what's there, and that means that getting hit is somewhat serious, so you are incentivized to just run in there and make sure you're consistently hitting bad guys to minimize the risk. Another thing I remember about aggression was, I didn't even play the game, but there was some Spider-Man game on the PS2 or the GameCube or something, I think, where you got to play as Venom. And I remember reading the review of this, and it said that Venom's health went down, I think, over time, so they incentivized you to attack civilians by having his health go down. And I think that's, I know it seemed like a decent incentive, but also it just makes you weirdly sympathetic for the monsters, and also I think that's a great example of how you can simply provoke aggressive behavior with fear. Venom kinda has to attack civilians. I don't know, it just feels like Venom's the innocent victim of the hunger or something there, but that's a separate question. Point being, yeah, just Venom's fear is what keeps him aggressive, and there doesn't seem to be any... I'm not sure there even is any other way of getting to aggression.
It's afraid!
It's probably also worth mentioning Resident Evil, which of course has always been a game about fight or flight. Pretty much the whole thing of the game since day one was that you stand there with your gun, you have your little gun, and the zombies walk towards you, and you try and shoot them, and the question that's just playing on your mind, kind of for the whole series, is just, should I stand and keep shooting my gun, or should I stop shooting my gun and run away? And most of the time they made fight or flight mutually exclusive, so it's absolutely about the fight or flight impulse, and that playback, and some of the early games are really interesting in letting you choose. I remember having some really great experiences playing Resident Evil 3 with some friends and having a moment where we shotgun one zombie, run around the other one, and then there you go, we fight, we flight, that's the game. Oh yeah, I should also say that some Resident Evil games, like Resident Evil 3, that this movement from fear to aggression really seems to be kind of the whole arc. Like, you start off running away from Nemesis, and eventually you end up attacking Nemesis, and I think that's kind of what people sign up for even. Like, if you're playing at Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, you kind of know what you're in for. You know that Nemesis is going to be a big part of the game. You know that it's a video game, so you know that everything that's in there can ultimately be overcome. So it really kind of is about facing a fear that you know can be faced, and learning the rules of the game, and just learning to overcome. So it's sort of a therapeutic experience, even. Another way to think about this is, if you played as a character who is invincible, like if you play a Doom guy who's invincible, how would that change the game? Like, if you could wander freely away from the monsters and not take damage, or you could just stand around and not take damage, that would completely ruin the game, right? If you think, what would it be like if I wasn't vulnerable? You realize you could just kind of chip away at the bad guys at your leisure. It might be kind of like a piñata or something. That's kind of a kiddie kind of experience. I love piñatas as game design, but without that vulnerability, if you just took that away, you can kind of see that I would just hang around kind of casually shooting at the monsters. I might even stop shooting the monsters and, you know, have a picnic or something. It would just be a completely different game. So there's no getting around, I think, this relationship between aggression and vulnerability, even though it's not obvious that people who are angry are afraid, but they kind of are. Maybe the other thing you've got to balance for the incentives is that there's got to be some hope to it, so that the door closes behind you and you've got the ability to fight back, so there has to be some kind of hope of victory, otherwise the players are likely to just get to despair instead, which is, I don't know, some kind of horrible middle ground between fighting and running away. When running away doesn't work, and fighting doesn't work, and nothing works, then you kind of got despair. So it's almost like there's emotional states that correspond to these incentives or something. So really what I'm trying to advertise here is that if you want to trigger certain emotions in players, there are kind of known rule-based ways to do it. You can figure out what makes somebody feel this way and break it down into quite specific rules. It's all designed to evoke feelings. If the door closes, or your moves work a certain way, or the bad guys work a certain way, these things can be manufactured, and that's kind of what well-designed video games are. Maybe a side thing to mention as well is that this tapping into fear and aggression can be kind of disturbing. Like, I know when it was first released, obviously a lot of violent video games get controversial. It's not just Doom. I know I talk about Doom a lot, but people found Doom kind of disturbing, and id Software was named after, you know, the Freudian id and everything. It was kind of a disturbing experience where you tapped into parts of yourself that don't normally get tapped into. So, as much as, you know, I'm all for, you know, make the video games you want to make, I also don't want to downplay that we are tapping into disturbing, normally unreached parts of ourselves. I hear the amygdala has a lot to do with fear. There's a monster called Amygdala in Bloodborne, which is kind of interesting. Or is it Amygdala?
Oh, Amygdala. Oh, Amygdala.
But anyway, yeah, so it taps into kind of primitive, crude parts of the brain that otherwise maybe don't get much exercise in our civilized world. And you get to play with that in a video game. So overall, conclusion time, I guess. I hate saying two sides of the same coin, but I'll say it anyway. Fear and aggression are two sides of the same coin, and you can provoke emotional reactions from players with known tactics. If you want your players to be aggressive, just close the door behind them, make sure they've got some kind of agency over the situation, make sure that if they don't attack, they're punished, make sure that if they do attack, they're rewarded, and you keep them pushed into this aggressive state. And more generally, this just applies to pretty much any emotion you want to trigger. Just find out what the triggers are and trigger them. Most indie game devs never finish their game. Why? No structure, no accountability, and no support. That's why I'm opening 5 private coaching spots to help devs get unstuck and finally finish their game. Message me game plan in my Discord and let's chat.